Всем привет. Меня зовут Борис Ларин, я эксперт.
Hello, everybody. Name is Boris Lorin, and I'm an expert with Kaspersky Labs, a great lab. We're actually doing research into the most sophisticated threats that we find across the landscape. I'm doing search and analysis of exploits. I've personally reporting 13 zero days that have been leveraged in various attacks, and all of them were targeting operating systems and web browsers. I'm a fan of reverse engineering, video games, and vulnerability research. And you can learn more about what I do following the QR code here. I've spoken at various conferences, but this is my first time at Page Days, and I'm happy to be talking to such a distinguished crowd. That's a very technical presentation. We'll be talking about privilege escalation on Windows and related zero-day exploits. So we'll be talking about CLFS, which is a driver which has attracted a lot of attention from threat actors. And I'll talk about 5 vulnerabilities and the ways to exploit them. They've all been exploited by ransomware operators, and some of them prove to be zero days. I guess everybody here knows what zero day is. So zero day is a hole in software that has not been patched. Moreover, the code that exploits this hole is also often called zero day. So if a researcher has identified a vulnerability and, well, this is zero day. Once he's written an exploit for that, that's zero day as well. So some of, those used for real attacks are often called ITW or in the wild zero day. So these are the ones that were found not by white hat researchers, but were witnessed in real-life attacks. Most researchers are doing searching for zero-day vulnerabilities, while I'm particularly interested in exploits. We do have some awesome technologies that help us do all this, and we believe that, with great power comes great responsibility. And our responsibility is to make the internet safe for everybody, because threat actors are leveraging huge efforts and resources in identifying and exploiting zero days. There is a lot of money there, in fact. And as patches get released, this certainly thwarts the plans of threat actors and robs them of their ill-gotten, not of what they've already earned, but rather of their capability to earn more. So very briefly, we use KSN to analyze exploits that have already been detected. We also develop technologies to detect and protect against exploits and targeted attacks. We'll also reverse code. We'll identify the root cause of a vulnerability. If it's something interesting, if it's potentially a zero day, we'll develop a proof of concept, and then we inform the vendor who has been affected. We're actually quite successful at that. You can see here pretty intimidating list of zero-day vulnerabilities that have been discovered using our products. They've all been leveraged in real-life attacks, and they have all been patched, and vendors have thanked us for detecting them. Have we not found them, they will continue to be exploited for who knows how long, to the detriment of pretty much everybody involved. And this is not the full list. These are just the latest ones, and only the ones related to the bigger systems like Windows, Internet Explorer, Chrome. This is my first presentation at PH Days. So let me give you my top 3 findings. So the first one is a commercial framework for zero-day attacks against web browsers we call ChainShot. Super complex, super interesting. It was delivered with a whole arsenal of zero-day exploits. We're able to find 3, but we have evidence suggesting there were way more. There were numerous very complex techniques used Windows there with direct manipulation of kernel memory
либо исполнение
in order to execute kernel-level code or in order to execute from user-level kernel functions
инжекта полезная группа
using RobChain.
системный процесс, чтобы
Well, using a payload from the browser, sort of converting it into the kernel. My second big favorite is an APT attack called Puzzle Maker. And major businesses were attacked using a chain of 0 days for Google Chrome and Microsoft Windows. What's interesting is that an exploit for a single vulnerability was publicly available on GitHub for several years. And it was only removed, it was only patched once we discovered that it was actually leveraged in that particular kill chain. And finally, a watering hole attack through a Korean news portal. So all the users who accessed this portal were attacked with a chain of 0 days, and were all affected and infected.
Exploit в Google Chrome.
So they used RC exploit for Google Chrome, which exploited a race condition between audio and rendering threads. But for the sandbox, they actually use a different vulnerability in Win32k EOP component, which means that only older versions of Windows below Windows 10 were affected, the ones that didn't have Win32k lockdown. We've got presentations, we've got articles covering all this. You should be able to find it all online if you're interested. So you must have gathered already that 0 days are mostly used by IPTs in targeted attacks. However, our latest findings show that financially motivated attackers, including ransomware operators, are using extensively 0-day vulnerabilities. So Microsoft patched the latest 0-day they found last month, and in that particular case, ransomware operators attacked various SMEs, their servers. There were numerous attacks across the world. So in these attacks, the final payload they used was Nakayama payload. This is something I've been tracking personally for nearly a year, because I first started thinking, so to speak, about that group in June 2021, I think, when they used a one-day vuln. So interestingly, they've been using various vulnerabilities. In the course of a year, I found like 5 different vulnerabilities they were trying to exploit it. At least some of them were 0 days, and they were actually very similar. Like 80% of the code they were using was the same. There were lots of identical strings and debugging messages. Most exploits were very much obfuscated. So deobfuscation required a lot of effort, and there was a lot of junk code, which made compilation more difficult. It all showed that all these exploits, at least all suggested all this exploit had the same author, and they were being used by the same actors. For a year, this actor preferred not to use their 0 days on machines running our products. But then, in February, they used 0 days in their attacks, and this is when I spotted them again, and I sent information to Microsoft. Now, what is CLFS? It's a driver on Windows, which should enable applications to create their own data logs or event logs. It's effectively a logging function. Now, these logs are composed of several key elements. One is the so-called base log file, which contains a lot of metadata, but there is also an arbitrary number of containers that contain the actual data, and it can vary greatly. The file format has not been documented by Microsoft. It's not actually difficult, and it has been reversed for quite some time, and there's some debugging information. I personally reversed it for my research purposes because public documents tend to be riddled with little mistakes, which, by the way, was the case here as well. So a single look at the structure of these files will make one very worried, because this is the kernel structure, and it does have files for storing some critical kernel values. Microsoft is not exactly hiding it, though they're not really making it very public. So in their website, you will see this description that CLFS is optimized for performance. And these records are buffered in the client's marshalling area using a flush operation. So you can instantly guess that the same happens when the reading process happens. And that would be the right guess, which means that there is a pretty old code base, pretty complex functionality optimized for performance, and file or GBIS structures are analyzed in the kernel. I'm not a big fan of that, but it has kernel pointers of all things there, and it's optimized for performance, not for security. So when you see at least some of these elements together, that should get you worried, because this is not really a short name for safe code. Now, if we start looking for CLFS, we will discover that at least 33 privilege escalation vulnerabilities have been discovered since 2018, and at least 4 of them have been used in real life in the wild attacks. Well, the format of BLF files is not that complicated. BLF files consists of records. These records are stored in blocks. The blocks are written and read sector by sector. Sector size is 200 bytes, and the 2 last bytes contain sector signature. So these records, depending on their type, can contain additional data structures, and we will consider them separately as well. Every block starts with a block header. Naturally, we are interested in the array that contains record offsets, all of them. However, what's hard-coded is just the first offset. We're also interested in the signatures offset, but we will talk about it a bit later. BLF files consist of 6 blocks. You can see here their types. In fact, total number of types is 3, not 6, because shadow blocks contain a copy of the data recorded. All this is done in order to make sure that if the reading process is interrupted for any reason, you would have a previous record to fall back upon. So you see here types of records, and all records start with the structure CLFS, blah, blah, blah. It's actually called time count, and it is used in order to assess which of the blocks is the freshest one. It also used read metadata block function, and then, it chooses either a regular block or a shadow block. So the most valid and fresh block is used in order to ascertain validity, CRC checksum of the blocks, and some other fields are analyzed. So the first block belongs to the control type, and it sits at the very beginning of the BLF file. It is used in order to increase or decrease the size of the log, and it also contains a map of all the other blocks, their offsets, their sizes, and so on. Shown here is the map of blocks that you will see when you create a new log. So all these blocks will have the same kind of offsets, they will have the same sizes. Naturally, exploit that, they will find it pretty easy to patch something residing at a particular offset, then they will adjust the checksum, and voila. In particular, we're interested in a particular block called general, I think. So there you will find information on containers. These are the files that contain factual data. and they're represented with container context structure. They're also used to contain information on security descriptors. However, this information is only stored in the memory, so we're not going to talk about it. Shown here is the format of the base record for the general block, which is a record of, well, as the name suggests, the general, the main block. It is used to store these context structures, and these context structures are shown as symbols. A symbol is effectively a combination of CLF hash sim structure and the structure that follows it, which is usually a context structure. Now, it's shown this way in order to simplify finding any context you need, well, by using its hash. So you can use this function to find it, or you can iterate and go from offset to offset. And this is the function that gets used when a block gets close, for example, and you need to release all descriptors. In that case, you may want, rather than using the hash table, rather you want to run across the whole array. And I'm actually showing here offset arrays. We're also interested in CB symbol zone. In fact, it corresponds to the size of the zone occupied with symbols. Since this zone sits right after the header, it effectively becomes the next available offset in this area. So the driver can use it to create some new data structure. So this structure, CLF hash sim, we're particularly interested in these two elements, that's symbol offset and context structure offset. And the code sort of assumes that this particular structure sits right in front of context structure offset. Well, because they calculate 12 or 16 bytes from the very beginning of context structure, and then they address those fields. Looks like a crutch or a band-aid to me. Now, this is the format of client context, and it does contain information on the BLF file. And note this. Note the container context. Do you see the P container pointer? That's actually a pointer to class F container, which is a kernel class pointer. So all the structures we have discussed, they are stored just like that in a disk file. And these are the ingrained issues that CLFS has. It would be so logical, to read the file, to parse it, to decompose different entities to different structures to different areas of memory. Not really, not the case. They are actually all sorted in blocks read from the file, and every time code wants to get access to any of the structures, it will reparse all the blocks using those relative offsets. It can also swap these blocks, it can add new structures, or it can change existing ones. And therefore, there can be partial overlap with structures. If that happens, consequences may be difficult to predict. Many of the vulnerabilities we are going to discuss actually stem from this particular issue. Given that it's all stored in the memory like this, under the current reality, given the current security profile of Windows OS, if we damage a pointer to a CCLFS container or an offset for obtaining CLFS container context, that creates lots of opportunities to exploit the system and escalate privileges. That is going to enable the exploit to read and write through kernel memory.
На самом деле, я предполагаю, то, что я видел по артефактам, то, что этот эксплойт разрабатывался как one-day для
Now, the artifacts I see suggest it has been developed as a one-day exploit for a CD that was discovered in April 2022. I actually believe that the author of all these exploits has learned a lot about exploiting CLFS as he was working on this particular exploit. In order to exploit it, all you gotta do is patch these 5 values. We're particularly interested in the last one, because it's effectively an offset to client context. The nature of this vulnerability becomes clear when we interpose this structure on the data that's already available in the BLF file. And that's something you can see here. So on the left, you see the data that's already available in the file when the log is being created, and on the right, you see this structure we are overlaying. So you can see the particular fields that get patched. So naturally, a same name field gets patched, otherwise client context will not be seen as valid. Client ID is not that important, but the fact that the time of log creation sort of intersects with the client context class ID, that's weird. So when BLF gets opened or closed, containers do the following, like initialize function will cache some values from client context, including file creation date, and up to that load container queue function will be used in order to load containers to open files. This way, this value will be attributed to CCLFS container. When you close BLF, flush metadata function is going to restore the cache data of file creation for the client. Since these structures overlap, this data restoration is going to rewrite flash container data. And since the value is controlled by the attacker, it will be handed over as a pointer for CCLFS container close. So it's very easy for a perpetrator to allocate some buffer here, put a valid file descriptor with the right offset there, and then they should be able to reduce the arbitrary value in the memory. Moreover, this capability enables a very powerful previous mode technique. The thing is that all flows, all threads in the kernel are represented as kernel threads, and there is a lone quote-unquote there called kernel thread previous mode. Now, why so? Some system functions on Windows can be called with the drivers, but they can also be summoned with user-level code. You will need syscalls for that. And some functions will check where a particular code was invoked from the kernel or from the user level, because some functions can actually be very dangerous, particularly if they are summoned from the user level. For example, anti-read virtual memory and anti-write virtual memory will necessarily check this field in order to see whether they need to allow such access to kernel memory or not. By default, 0 means kernel mode, 1 means user mode. So if we reduce it from 0 to 1, the system will think that the user-level thread is in fact kernel thread, which means it should be allowed to execute these very dangerous functions. I believe it's an extremely powerful, very awesome technique. It's almost God mode, like you reduce 1 to 0 and you become omnipotent. The first time it's mentioned is in an article published in 2011, Modern Kernel Pool Exploitation Attacks and Techniques by Tarjei Mand. And it is only mentioned there en passant. I don't think it has ever been used in real-life exploits until 2018. And in 2018, it was used by the framework I mentioned previously, which is ChainShot, obviously. I do believe it's a very powerful technique. I talked about it at Blue Hat in, I think, Shanghai, right, in 2019. Unfortunately, this attack has been used a lot in various exploits after our presentation, and you may wonder why I talked about that. And my counter argument is that this technique has been pretty well known before that. It has been used in exploits before that. I mean that, a handful of people knew it and used it. When we talked about it, Microsoft finally got around to patching it. So if you install the latest versions of Windows 11, just updating it won't work. You need to install the new build. So if this build is dated after, or sooner, so to speak, than mid-November 2022, then, you will be protected against this technique, which is a win-win if you ask me. In order to leverage this technique, you absolutely need a kernel address, and the exploit gets this address using an API, which is very well known and used in numerous exploits. In fact, this API will disclose pretty much any information about kernel memory. It's called anti-query system information. So it returns the ID for the class of information you are requesting. You can use it to get addresses of all the drivers which are up and running. You can use it, for example, in order to mount your ROB chain, or you can also use it to discover all the assets which are currently available in the memory if you want to exploit them. Fortunately, this information is only available for medium integrity level users or processes, while web browsers are considered low integrity level processes. According to Microsoft, availability of this information to medium integrity level is by design. It's not a bug. Well, they like to say that it's not a security boundary. And if such information is disclosed to low-integrity user or process, then it's indeed considered a vulnerability. And this is exactly what happened to the vulnerability which was used in the exploit chain leveraged by puzzle maker ABT. Also known as Superfetch tick. It recently became known that the same technique is going to be addressed in the next version of Windows 11. And in order for this technique to be properly fixed, you will need to not just update, but install clean and new Windows 11. And I'm afraid that for most users, it will take years, which means that for many years more, we are going to see this technique successfully used in the world. Shown here are all stages of exploitation. So the exploit first gets addressed for the previous mode flag, and in the same manner, it will get all the other addresses. Then it allocates a buffer for this address, positions there with the right offset the data that it needs. Then it triggers the vulnerability and decreases the previous mode flag, and then uses syscalls to rewrite system tokens. All the stuff that is usually done by so many other exploits, which fall into the privilege escalation category. Exploit number 2 dating back to September 2022. In fact, in September 2022, Microsoft took care of 2 CLFS ERB vulnerabilities. One was classified as 0 day. It's a shame we were not the ones to detect it. So interestingly, this exploit does not work with the September patch, meaning it was patched in September. However, its exploitation is very different from the exploitation of a publicly known 0 day, so I'm not entirely sure which particular CVE was used for that exploit. And like I said, blocks are read and written sector by sector. The last 2 bytes in every sector contain sector signature, so it can easily happen that the signature will overlap structural data, which means that you gotta store the original data somewhere so that after block decoding, the data can be written back. The original bytes are stored in the array, and the offset to that array is stored in the lock block header structure. Signature writing is done by CLFS encode block and CLFS decode block functions. Exploit will create fake structures of the base record, header, and container context, but they will only be used after the vulnerability has been triggered. After that, the exploit will move the legit structure of client structure so that the offset of one of the fields overlaps the offset for the sector signature, and then it patches it. So if previously it would point at the last block after the patch, it starts pointing at the first one, where the header of the block is stored. What we see here is that the new position for storing original bytes of sector 11 is going to overlap and like obscure the sector record. So signature of sector 12, we can calculate here, which sector it corresponds to. We can calculate the offset, and then we shall see that the location of it coincides with the client data position. Moreover, the signature is the same. Yes, for the file attribute field, which is responsible for the flag attribute of the BLF file, which must have already told you how to trigger this particular vulnerability. So when you open the file, the code will try to read this block, it will invoke the function, it will restore original bytes, where the sector signature is stored. And you can see here what it will look like in the memory. After that, the exploit is going to trigger TLS log archive mode. And after that, when it's time to flush all the changes to the drive, write metadata block and another function will be invoked to encode blocks and write changes to the drive. And that will result in recalculation of original bytes, which will be put in the table for storing original bytes. So as a result of this operation, this mangled bytes will be rewritten into offset records. And because of the way it works, and it does reparse all offsets to access the structure, instead of the legitimate records using 0x70 offset, the malicious records from a different offset, 2070, will be used. And pointer to CCLFS container will already be pointing at a value that's controlled by the attacker, and in the runtime, there's no way you can see if it's malicious or not. So it does look like the exploit we discussed previously. Third case. Security update guide for October 22 does not mention single CLFS vulnerability. However, you will see that the driver code has been changed significantly, and lots of new validate functions have been added. The exploit that was used by the threat actors would still work with the September patch, but not with the October patch. I'm not entirely sure if Microsoft has observed some exploitation in the wilds, or if they simply had this update in the works. But the fact remains that this particular exploit is no longer valid starting October. This exploit only patches 6 values, and the last 5. You know them already. It creates fake container context. So the vulnerability is triggered with the first value. It effectively patches the symbol zone, which is effectively the size of the zone which is occupied with all the current symbols. And the new value is smaller than the client context structure, which is pre-existent in the file, and there is no check for that. Which means that when file is open again, driver will hash some data from client context again, just like with the exploit number 1. Then the exploit is going to invoke add log container to create new context, and it will be written using the preferred symbol. And just like with exploit number 1, client context and container context will overlap again. So if we take existing data and we add the stuff that oh right, you see X40, you see that there will be overlap. And you will see that LSN restart overlaps with other functions, and flush metadata is going to restore cached values, which means that it's a take effectively on the April CVE. And the changes that were made to address the CVE in April are obviously insufficient.
И перейдем к финальным эксплойтам. Эксплойт номер 4.
And the final exploits, number 4 and number 5. October changes, this numerous validate functions, made exploitation of the general block much more difficult. That's why threat actors turn to other blocks.
Для этих двух CVE-шек, они практически абсолютно одинаковые. Различаются только...
Exploit codes for this CVEs are almost identical. The only differ by patches, so to speak. The first CV is yet another manipulation of signatures offset, while the second one is a logical vulnerability, which is actually different from all the previous ones. Now, the control block, like I said, is used to store information on the map of all existing blocks. It is also used in order to increase or decrease the log size. I am also showing here all the areas that are related to a log enlargement, so to speak. When you open the block, open image function is invoked. At the end, it will check if it needs to resume the interrupted operation. It does extend state to do that. If extend state is 0, then everything is fine. If it's other than 0, then it will launch a bunch of various checks, indexes, index of the block to increase, and index of the block to write to the drive. You see there are lots and lots of checks happening there. The thing is that all this indices gotta be smaller than 6. Otherwise, you will be reading a pointer which will be outside the map, so to speak. However, the function doesn't check for that. Indexes are checked by the open image function, the one that invokes everything. However, the same function, such as extend metadata block, can be invoked elsewhere with other functions, and somehow it's assumed that bad indexes can only be handed over from files on the drive, which is not really the case. So the idea is that the existing functions should protect you from bad things, but will they? This makes me think of the classical venue of attack, so to speak, time of check versus time of use. So if something happens to control block or indexes after the initial check, this will create an opportunity for exploitation. Lots of things have already been patched, and exploit number 4 moves the legit structure so that offset of field 1 overlaps with the sector signature. After that, the value of this record is changed in order to invoke the functionality of block enlargement, and then it actually injects the malicious logic. And it also increases symbol zone size in order to invoke extend metadata block when a new symbol gets added, in order to invoke this function again when all the checks have already been done. And then the exploit patches signatures offset just like it did in the second exploit. So the data from the last block goes to the first one. So we see the same picture as before, right, as in exploit 1. So original bytes for storing signatures for sector 0 are the same as for the sector 1, I think, right? So it is very similar to exploit number 2. So the CLFS function is going to restore CLFS decode block, and then the code will perform dump counts plus because it will want to validate that the block is good, has done its job, this is a fresh version of it, and when the time comes to flush it all to the drive, self-assemble block will update the original bytes and will thus rewrite the offset records, and then because of reparsing of all the blocks, the malicious record will get used. In other words, this vulnerability is identical to the vulnerability used for exploit number 2. It just that back then it was base record and general blocks that were exploited, but here we see same technique applied to other blocks. And this is exploit number 5. So the vulnerability that was found by me and addressed in April is arguably the most complex, but at the same time, it's so easy. You just needed to change one byte to catch it with fuzzing. So the exploit here changes the control record in the control block to invoke extend metadata block in open image. Then the exploit positions a malicious record in the control shadow block. So first the control record is changed, then its shadow copy is changed, and this way the malicious record will be stored in the shadow copy. Extend metadata block in open image will be using control record because its time count is higher than that of the shadow record. And it will also increase symbol zone size in the general block, because if the exploit invokes a function for adding the new container, the code will try to add a new symbol, and it will then invoke extend metadata block function again. And finally, it reduces valid sector count from 2 to 1. The size of the control block is 4 bytes. It's fixed, you divide it by 2. So it reduces it from 2 to 1, like I said. I have reversed this function. Now what you can see here is not exactly the way it is in the code. I've decided to make it just a bit more readable for the audience. So what the code does is try to decode both blocks, the control block and its shadow copy. If both blocks are okay, the freshest one is used, and they rely on the time count field to make this assessment. If one of them is bad, only the valid one will be used. If both are bad, then the function will return an error. Now let's discuss CLFS decode block function. So what we see here is that they are checking the checksum, and in order for the function to be completed successfully, checksum should be correct, or there should be other flags present. And like Microsoft says, all the work is done in place in order to calculate the checksum. They gotta first zeroize it in the block, which is what they do. After that, they recalculate the checksum, and then they invoke CLFS decode block private function. Inside this function, you will also see some other checks. They will check the version of the block. They will also check if the decoded sector is smaller than the number of all the other sectors. And this is the code for the CFS encode block, the one that's called when you try writing this block to the drive. So checksum is zeroized, and then CLFS encode block private function is called.
Вы можете видеть, что на самом деле вот эти проверки
You can see here that CLFS decode and encode block privates are different. They're just a name.
проверяет количество валидных секторов.
So decode block will not check the number of valid sectors, while encode will.
Количество валидных секторов должно быть меньше.
So they want to see that the number of valid sectors is smaller than the total number of sectors, which means that there is some inconsistency in checks performed by decode and encode block functions.
Ну, как бы вот эта неконсистентность — это одна проблема. А вторая проблема...
Inconsistency is one issue we are seeing there. Another issue is that when this function is called, the value it returns is not checked at all.
Блок checksum
So if a check is failed and checksum is zeroized,
записывается на диск,
and the sector as sector is written to the drive, from that moment on, that block will be considered corrupt, because its checksum is zero.
И что делает эксплойт? И что происходит во время эксплуатации этого эксплойта?
So what happens when this exploit is used or executed? Extend metadata block function will invoke read metadata block, and the read metadata block will check which of the control blocks to use, so the general or the shadow copy.
Как бы просто control block из того, что у него...
It will use the control block in most cases because it has a higher time count. Then extend metadata block function will invoke write metadata block function, and then it will effectively corrupt control block. It will set its checksum to zero. Since the check will fail, the code will not update it.
И потом
And
эксплойт попробует добавить новый символ.
once exploit starts adding a new symbol,
Extend metadata блок повторно.
it will run extend metadata block function
Использование
again,
control shadow.
and after that we are going to invoke the unverified shadow block because the original one has a bad checksum.
Metadata block сможет использовать вот
Then extend metadata block will be able to use unverified indexes for the flush block and the extended block. How can this be tapped for exploitation and for privilege escalation? Well, again, we can use dump count and malicious container context.
отдельный BLF файл,
The exploit will create an additional BLF file with fake structures, with record header and container context.
который ликает всю информацию о ядре.
And the API I've mentioned will leak all the information from the kernel and will return kernel memory address for the BLF that we're interested in.
Верифицировано в память. Потом в памяти
After that,
на его
in the memory, address
general блоке,
for its offset record general blocks is heap sprayed.
что flush блок
And after that,
сбрасываемого блока
because iflash block index
за границами
is beyond the boundaries of the buffer with a block map,
спрейное значение,
the heap spray value will be used as the address for the block stars.
сделать, когда он
This way,
увеличит dump count,
when the code starts or tries to increase dump count, it will effectively change a different offset, which should be pointing to a valid record. But instead,
невалидную вредоносную
it will be pointing now to a malicious invalid record with malicious container context, which has a class pointer pointing at a malicious value controlled by the attacker, and then the attacker can allocate the buffer.
в первом эксплойте.
And, after that, we're back to square one of exploit number one.
Большое спасибо Microsoft, то, что
In conclusion, I'm very grateful to Microsoft for reacting pretty fast
патчат все
to this report.
в этот раз.
They're actually pretty fast in reacting to all our reports from Kaspersky, and I'm grateful to them on a regular basis. I'm glad that they decided to patch this one as well.
выйдет в новых версиях Windows
So when this feature is released in the new versions of Windows 11,
на более свежую версию.
I absolutely recommend that you all install the new version of Windows 11 once this particular vulnerability is patched.
Я боюсь, что CLFS
Based on what I've personally seen,
для
I believe that CLFS will remain a juicy target for threat actors.
количества зеродеев это по
You
факту
must have seen already
копии уязвимости, которые были
this multitude of 0 days, which are nearly identical copies of each other. If you are into vulnerability hunting,
бачили. Как они это сделали и можно ли это как-то обойти?
one of potential venues for you is to see what Microsoft has recently patched and see if you can play with those vulnerabilities. It could be a profitable venue, I guess.
Банальные уязвимости, где достаточно просто
So simple file format, banal vulnerabilities.
просто
You know, these things are so easy to find with fuzzing.
вообще вот последний момент нас очень настораживает то, что зеродеи
We're very concerned
только в таргетированных атаках.
that previously would see 0 days only used for targeted attacks, but now we see them used more and more often by
Как это старгетировано?
profit-seeking, so to speak, threat actors.
Целиться на какую-нибудь одну
Now, APTs will usually want to attack a single organization. I mean, it's still bad, but
финансово
you know, the total surface will be, well, a handful of machines, not millions. While for financially motivated hackers,
какую-то определенную
such vulnerabilities can be nothing short of a Klondike, I think.
закончен.
Thank you very much. This was the end of my presentation.
Замутили крутой
And my
квест,
colleagues
поэтому при желании
have developed a great hack quest. By all means, participate following this QR code. Thank you.
Ну, один вопрос. Времени практически у меня не осталось.
I have time for one question only. I'm sorry about that.
Спасибо. Отличный доклад. Пару коротких вопросов. Получается, ты говоришь, что определенный адрес переписки...
Couple of short questions. So you say that a particular address is written to user space.
Правильно я понял, что если у тебя в ядре
Is that correct? Second one,
сложный формат, который нужно parsing,
if there is some complex format in the kernel to be parsed and control flow integrity and all other hardening techniques
произвольную запись и
are no good because it's so easy to do arbitrary writes.
Вопросы на...
That's a great question, or in fact, great two questions.
Ну, это современных процессов.
So SMAPs me, in modern CPUs, there are special checks
Например,
that enable you to see where a particular code was invoked from.
код прыгает внезапно
If a kernel level code
создается
jumps into the user level,
поведение. Как бы в винде вот эта техника, проверка технологии, она работает. То есть нельзя из...
that will be tracked, that will be noticed. You cannot simply go from kernel, I'm sorry, into the kernel with from user level code. You actually need some powerful techniques
Образом этот шел-код в ядро,
to allocate the shellcode into the kernel
ядерный
so that the kernel can then address the kernel code. While the SMAP technology,
работать
which checks
которые
which kind of objects you are trying to work with from the kernel. You know, on Windows, it doesn't work.
что
You're absolutely right about that.
эксплуатация
Had there been SMAP,
тривиальна, скорее всего, потому что
exploitation would still be trivial, however, because we do have the API which tells us where in memory individual objects are located.
следующий
So
логический
it's only natural for Microsoft
диску, который все ликает,
to address it. You know, they've just shattered
эксплуатация будет
this API.
ну, даже не чуть, возможно,
You know, if they add SMAP,
сложнее.
exploitation will become a bit more difficult.
Да.
I forgot your second. Oh, right.
Control flow integrity.
Arbitrary right and control flow integrity.
Control flow integrity в данный момент, ну,
Control flow integrity at the moment.
Microsoft есть вот этот mitigation, называется
Well, right now, Microsoft has got this mitigation called CFG,
планирует заменить более новый
and they plan to replace it
XFG.
with the newer mitigation called X of G.
планируют заменить, как бы...
Well, the fact they've stopped promoting it must go a long way in terms of suggesting, what kind of plans they have for it. Thank you very much. If you have additional questions, please talk to me
Всё, большое спасибо.
outside this talk, okay? Thank you very much.